Okay friends, it's time to get started on replacing our electric cooling fan from the front of the vehicle. Now to do this job, you're going to have to drain some of the coolant out of the vehicle because we're going to have to remove that upper radiator hose. Keep that in mind. You're going to want to have some nice, clean, fresh coolant and of course, hand and eye protection at all times. Let's get started. Okay friends, to get started on this, one of the first things that I always like to do is come right over to my negative battery terminal and relieve this nut right here so I can pull this off. Just keep in mind, when you do this, you're going to reset your stations on the radio, the clock, and a couple miscellaneous other things. We can go ahead and set this aside so it's making no contact with the battery terminal. The next thing we're going to do is come right over to the radiator cap. We're going to go ahead and give it a little touch just to make sure it's nice and cool. You didn't just come back from a nice drive. After that, press it down, turn it counterclockwise, and lift it up and away from your face just in case there's any pressure in the system. Inspect it, set it aside. Now we're just going to come right down here to the lower aspect of the driver's side of the radiator. Go ahead and grab onto this area. This is considered your petcock, or the drain for the cooling system. Give it a little squeeze, turn it counterclockwise, and start draining the coolant. Now from underneath the vehicle, we're going to continue on to removing this area of the fan shroud. You're going to see that it's separate from the main area of the fan shroud. To do that, I'm going to use this angled pick, carefully get in between this area, and then I'm just going to carefully try to pry and separate the two. As I'm doing this, now as I'm trying to pry and separate this, I'm also going to grab onto this tab where you can see my index finger and just carefully give that a little pull, and it should want to separate. We'll do the same thing to this other side. This should be a little easier now. Now typically you just want to grab this, push it towards the engine, give it a little wiggle, and you can pull it right out of here. Okay, so now at this point we're going to start removing this fan clutch from the water pump located up there. That's going to give us access to be able to remove this so we can continue on with everything else we have to do. Now to remove the fan clutch from the water pump, you're going to see that you have a 36mm nut up there. To loosen this from the water pump, you're going to have to turn that 36mm nut clockwise, the opposite direction that you would normally turn things to loosen it. Now once that's broken free, continue turning it clockwise until it comes off. Just keep in mind, when it does come off, it's going to want to fall down, so watch your face. Carefully remove the fan from the vehicle. The next thing we're going to do is continue on to removing this lower shield from the fan shroud. To do that, you're going to find 3 press clips. There's one located on the driver's side, in towards the center, and then all the way over on the passenger side. To remove these, I'm just going to use a fork tool. You can also use whatever you have, a screwdriver. Gently pry in between these 2 areas to separate them. Okay, so now let's come right over to this mounting point that holds the radiator hose to the fan shroud. I'm going to carefully try to get in between this center area and then try popping this clamp free. Okay, so now we can carefully separate this. The next thing we're going to do is move right over to this area for the upper radiator hose. Go ahead and squeeze this clamp, pull it up a little bit, remove the hose from the radiator. I'm just going to use some hose clamp pliers, but you could also use regular pliers if that's what you have access to. Carefully grab that hose, remove it from the radiator. Keep in mind there could potentially still be coolant inside this area. We'll set that aside. Now we can make our way over to the bottom of the passenger side of the radiator. We'll just go ahead and grab onto this clamp that holds the lower hose to the radiator. Squeeze that with our hose clamp pliers or regular pliers. Go ahead and slide that up the hose there. And now we can remove the hose from the radiator. Keep in mind there could still be coolant in this area. Make sure you have your collection bucket underneath this area. Now let's just go ahead and use a hose pick, and we're going to carefully get in between the hose and the radiator, being very careful not to damage the hose in any way. All I want to do with this essentially is just make my way right around it. That's going to help break it free so we can remove it from the radiator. There we are. Once the hose is off, we're going to continue on to the mounting bolts that hold each side of the fan shroud to the radiator. You're going to find a 13 millimeter over on the driver's side and the same exact thing over on the passenger side. Remove the pair. Go ahead and set that bolt aside. Do the same on the other side. Now the next thing we're going to do is come right down to this area here, carefully grab onto it. We're going to give it a little wiggle to remove it from the fan housing. The next thing that we're going to want to do is squeeze right on this area where you can see my thumb at. We'll give that a little squeeze, and then we're going to separate these two areas. Anytime you disconnect an electrical connector, you always want to inspect it. If you see any funny colors, it's probably corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This looks fine, so I can set it aside. Now let's carefully grab onto the fan shroud here. We're going to give it a little wiggle and pull it up and out of the vehicle. Set it aside. Now at this point, we have a nice clear view of our fan assembly here. To remove this from the radiator, we're going to have to go ahead and grab onto this tab that you can see my index finger on. Go ahead and give that a little press. Now I'm going to lift up on this side. Do the same on the other side. And now we can remove this from the vehicle. There it is, friends. On the original fan, right up in the center, you're going to find this clip. I will just go ahead and take that off. We're going to be reusing this. Now we can start putting in our electric fan assembly. Let's go ahead and carefully start putting it down and into position. What we're looking for is our lineup tabs that are on either side of this fan, and make sure that they're lined up with the radiator as well. So I'm just going to bring it down. I can see my tab here. It's pretty much lined up. Make sure that bottom side is as well as we bring it down. And while I'm doing all that, I'm also going to be looking over towards the other side of the vehicle and lining that up as well. Okay. Now once you feel as though you have them all in there, you just want to double check, because if one's out, you can take this fan and you can wiggle it around, and you definitely don't want this fan to be loose inside of this compartment. Once you're sure it feels like it's matched up, go ahead and press it down in there and make sure those locking tabs are completely latched right here. See, I can lift this up and it doesn't want to go anywhere. If it's not latched in, this is going to wobble around. Double check both sides. Let's take that clip that's supposed to fit over the top of the fan assembly. We'll just slide it right down and over, and as you're going to notice, it needs to also slide over that radiator lip right there. Go ahead and press it on there. Make sure it's secure. Give your fan a wiggle. That feels great. Alright, so now we can go ahead and put our fan shroud in here. Just like that other fan, this has those little hooks along both sides of it that you need to make sure that slide into the position right up against that radiator. Get it down in here. Okay, slide it over. Get both of the passenger side tabs looking like they're lined up. You can slide this right down. That one in. That side looks good. Do the same on this side. Okay. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and put in our mounting bolts that hold the fan shroud and the fan to the radiator. Start this one in. We'll start in the other side as well, and then we can snug them up. Now on the driver's side, let's go ahead and plug in that fan assembly. Let's get it lined up, slide it in, listen for a click. Once you have it clicked in, give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Go ahead and put it into its position on the fan shroud assembly. There we are. Let's go ahead and get this lower radiator hose on here. Slide it all the way up against the radiator. After that, go ahead and grab that clamp, slide it into its original position. Now I'm just going to use my hose pliers here. You can also use regular pliers, whatever you use to remove it. Make sure you grab onto that hose, give it a nice wiggle to make sure it's secure. All right, now let's go ahead over here to the petcock. We're going to give this a little turn to the right to make sure it's completely tightened. You definitely don't want this leaking after you put everything together. Now let's re-secure this plate under here. Just go ahead and line it up with its mounting holes, slide in those push pins to lock them in. Now we can go ahead and get this fan on here. When we do this, we're going to be trying to put it on counterclockwise. Once again, this is essentially the opposite direction as you would normally try to loosen or tighten things. All right, now we'll just use our 36mm to go ahead and tighten that up the rest of the way. Okay. Just a couple little taps should lock it in. All right, so now we can get this lower shield in here. The areas that you want to pay attention to are along each of the edges. You're going to find a little hook. Also, of course, in the center of this, you're going to have all those locking tabs that we paid attention to earlier. So for this, I just want to take this, slide it right up and in. There we are. And now we can just swing this in. We'll slide this area right under here, lock it in. Make sure all the tabs are locked in so it's completely secured. Now back up top, it's time to start dealing with that upper radiator hose. We're going to take it, put it right into its mounting position on this. You can clip this in. Listen for a click, make sure it's secure there. Make your way over to where the radiator hose connects onto the radiator. Slide that right on. Bottom it out completely against the radiator, and then slide that clamp into its position. Make sure the clamp's completely straight and situated. Give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Let's reconnect that negative battery terminal. Place it right on there. Push it down as far as you can so it's completely down up against the battery. After that, we'll just go ahead and tighten up that 10mm nut so this is nice and snug and making full contact with the battery. Oh yeah. Okay, so now it's going to be time to fill the cooling system. There's a couple different ways you can do this. You can either use a funnel like I have here, or you can buy the specialty tool that's going to be able to do this for you as well. For me personally, I'll show you with the funnel because that's more than likely what you're going to be using. Now typically what I do is I just go ahead and use some of the manufacturer's specified coolant. We'll just go ahead and fill it right up inside here so it's approximately 3/4 or halfway up this funnel. Now we're just going to let this burp its way down into the cooling system. Once it's burped and we're sure that it seems like there's no more air coming up while it's just sitting, we'll go ahead and start up the vehicle. We're going to let it run for a little while. While it's running, we want to make sure that there's going to be heat coming from inside the vents, inside the passenger compartment, but you also want to be out here listening for the cooling fans to turn on. Once all that happens, you know the thermostat's open and all the coolant should be flowing freely. At that point, it's going to burp out all the air that's in the system. Once that's done, you should be good to go. Now, once you've run the vehicle for long enough for everything to burp out, like I had mentioned, go ahead and put your radiator cap on there. We're going to turn this clockwise until it ends up stopping. Just make sure that's completely secured. Once you've filled the radiator, it's always important to make sure that you check your coolant overflow. Typically, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the fluid that's inside there. Sometimes you can stick something down in there and go ahead and draw the fluid up and out. You're probably not going to get out all the fluid that's in there. So if you wanted to, you could of course take off the entire grill of this area here, unbolt it from this area, remove the whole thing, and then recycle that coolant as you did with the rest of the coolant. After that, put it all back together and then fill it up. Either way, you need to make sure you at least have coolant inside this overflow, and you can do that by checking this dipstick. Okay friends, we got the truck all back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to make sure that you clean down all that mess. You don't want to leave any coolant residue on the frame or anything the like. After that, go ahead and take it for a road test. While you're on your road test, pay attention to that temperature gauge that's on your dash. Essentially what we're going to be looking for is to make sure that it doesn't climb all the way up into the hot range. If it does, you might potentially have an air bubble inside the cooling system, and that's something that you want to take care of because you don't want to overheat your engine. Aside from that, assuming everything looks good, thanks for watching.